fusing her mouth to his. She pulled back and traced her lower lip with her finger. "I like a guy who tastes like me," she said. Jordan felt his erection swell again. Maybe he wouldn't in the evening just yet. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of our book club series. So, today we're going to be doing reading number 9, and we're starting on page 119, where it says Part 2, The Girl Next Door. Alright. It says, "And after all, what is a lie? 'Tis but the truth in masquerade." Lord Byron. "There is no refuge from confession but suicide, and suicide is confession." Daniel Webster. Okay. In the back of the police car, Chris shivered. They had the heat turned up full blast, and he had to sit sideways so that his handcuffs didn't cut into his back. And no matter what he did to get his bearings, he found himself shaking. "You all right back there?" the officer who wasn't driving asked. And Chris said yes, his voice cracking like a melon on that single syllable. He was not all right. He was not even marginally okay. He had never been so scared in his life. The car was redolent with the scent of coffee. The radio chattered in a dialect Chris did not understand, and for a moment that made perfect sense if his whole world went to pieces. Didn't it stand to reason that he'd no longer be able to speak the language? He bounced a little on his seat, concentrating on not peeing his pants. This was a mistake. His father and lawyer would meet him wherever they were taking him, and Jordan McAfee would do a Perry Mason speech, and everyone would realize they'd made a mistake. Tomorrow he would wake up and laugh this off. Suddenly, the car lurched to the left, and he saw light flash by the window. He completely lost track of time and direction, but he figured they were at Bainbridge Police Station. "Let's go," the taller policeman said, opening one of the rear doors. Chris scooted to the edge of the seat, trying to keep his balance with his hands all Houdini'd behind his back. With one foot on an embankment, Chris levered himself from the cruiser and landed flat on his face. The policeman hauled him up by his handcuffs and unceremoniously dragged him toward the station. He was carted in a back door he'd never noticed. The officer locked his gun in a box and radioed an intercom. Then a connecting door buzzed open. Chris found himself at the booking desk where a sleepy-eyed sergeant sat. He was allowed to sit while they asked him questions about his name and his age and address that he answered as politely as possible, just in case he got brownie points for good behavior. Then the policeman who'd taken him in stood him against the wall and had him hold a card up, just like in TV movies, with a number on it and the date. He turned right and left while a camera flashed. On command, Chris emptied his pockets and held out his hands for fingerprinting. 21 separate prints, a set for the local police, the state police, and the FBI. Then the officer cleaned his hands with a diaper wipe, took his shoes, his coat, his belt, and called on the intercom to have cell 3 opened. "Sheriff's on his way," he told Chris. "Sheriff's on his way," he told Chris. "The sheriff?" Chris asked, shuddering all over again. "How come?" "You can't stay here overnight," the policeman explained. "He'll transport you to the Grafton County Jail." "Jail?" Chris whispered. He was going to jail just like that? He stopped walking, effectively halting the cop who was beside him. "I can't go anywhere," he said. "My lawyer's coming here." The policeman laughed. "Really?" he said, and tugged him forward again. The holding cell was 6 feet by 5 feet in the basement of the police station. Chris had actually seen it before when he was in Cub Scouts and they'd taken a field trip to the Bainbridge Public Safety Building. It had a stainless steel sink and toilet combination and a bunk. Its door was made of actual bars, and there was a video camera trained on the inside. The policeman checked beneath the mattress for bugs, for weapons, then unlocked the handcuffs and ducked Chris inside. You hungry? He asked, thirsty. Shocked that the policeman would care about his creature comforts, Chris blinked up at him. He was not hungry, but sick to his stomach from everything else. He shook his head, trying to block out the sound of the cell clanking shut. He waited for the policeman to move down the hall, then stood up and urinated. He waited to tell the policeman who had booked him and the one who'd led him to this cell that he had not murdered Emily Gold. He wanted to tell the policeman who had booked him and the one who'd led him to this cell that he had not murdered Emily Gold. But his father had told him to keep quiet, and the warning cut through even the thick swath of fear that blanketed Chris. He thought about the birthday cake his mother had made, the candles burning down the frosting, the untouched half that was still on his plate, with its strawberry filling as bright as a line of blood. He ran his fingers along the pitted cinder block, and he waited. Next section. To Jordan McAfee, there was nothing better than sliding one's way down the terrain of a woman. He wrestled beneath the covers of his own bed, his lips and his hands measuring their way as if he were going to map this information. Oh, yes, she murmured, fisting her hands in his thick black hair. Oh, God. Her voice was getting loud, uncomfortably loud. He soothed his hand over her belly. Quiet, he murmured against her thigh. Remember? How, she said, could I ever forget? She grabbed his head and held it against her. At the same moment, he reared back to clap a hand over her mouth. Thinking it was a game, she bit him. Shit, he said, rolling off her. He slanted a glance toward the woman, lush and cross. Jordan shook his head, not even aroused anymore. He was usually better at judging these things. He rubbed his sore palm, thinking that he'd never go out with a friend of his paralegals again, and that if he did, he sure as hell wouldn't drink enough at dinner to invite her home. Look, he said, trying to smile amiably, I told you why. The woman, Sandra, that was it, rolled on top of him, fusing her mouth to his. She pulled back and traced her lower lip with her finger. I like a guy who tastes like me, she said. Jordan felt his erection swell again. Maybe he wouldn't in the evening just yet. The telephone rang, and Sandra batted off to the nightstand. As Jordan cursed and went to grab for the receiver, she wrapped her hand around his wrist. Leave it, she whispered. I can't, Jordan said, rolling away from her to fumble along the floor. McAfee, he said to the police. He said into the McAfee, he said into the phone. He listened quietly, coming alert instantly, his body performing by rote to pull a pen and pad from the nightstand and write down what the caller had said. Don't worry, he said calmly. We'll take care of this. Yes, I'll meet you there. He hung up the phone and came to his feet, with Leonin grace, smoothly stepping into the trousers that had been discarded near the bathroom door. I'm sorry to do this, Jordan said, zipping the fly, but I've got to go. Sandra's mouth dropped open. Just like that? Jordan shrugged. It's a job, but someone's got to do it, he said. He glanced at the reclining woman in his bed. You, don't have to wait for me, he added. What if I want to? Sandra asked. Jordan turned his back to her. It could be a long time, he said. He stuffed his hands into his pockets, offering her a last look. I'll call you, he said. You won't, she said. Sandra cheerfully disagreed, swinging her naked body off the bed. She disappeared into the bathroom and locked the door. Jordan shook his head and walked quietly into the kitchen. He fumbled around, looking for something to write on. Suddenly, the room flooded with light, and Jordan found himself staring at his 13-year-old son. What are you doing up? Thomas shrugged. Listening to things I shouldn't be, he said. Jordan scowled at him. You ought to be fast asleep. It's a school night. It's only 8:30, Thomas protested. Jordan's brow shot up. Was it really? How much had he had to drink at dinner? So, Thomas said, grinning. Did you come up for air? Jordan smirked. I liked it better when you were little. Back then I used to pee on the bathroom wall if I wasn't careful. I think this age is a hell of a lot better. Jordan wasn't so sure. He'd been raising his son alone since Thomas was 4, when Deborah had decided that motherhood and marriage to a career-driven lawyer did not suit her. She had walked into his office with their son, divorce papers, and a one-way ticket to Naples. The last Jordan had heard, she was living with a painter twice her age on the left bank in Paris. Thomas watched his father swill straight from the carafe of day-old cold coffee. "That's gross," he said, although maybe not quite as gross as bringing home a... "Enough," Jordan said. "I shouldn't have, okay? You're right, and I'm wrong." Thomas smiled radiantly. "Yeah? Can we get this historic moment on video?" Jordan set the carafe back in the Mr. Coffee machine and tightened the noose of his tie. "That was a client on the phone. I've got to go." He whirled into his jacket, still draped over a chair, and turned back to his son. "Don't call the beeper number if you need me. Apparently it's on the blitz. Ring the office. I'll check my voicemail." "I won't need you," Thomas said. He gestured towards his father's bedroom. "Maybe I should go say hi." "Maybe you should get your butt back into your room," Jordan said, smiling at Thomas, and then he whisked out the door with the feel of his son's admiration lightly riding on his shoulders. Next section. Gus leaned into the rear of the car, buttoning Kate's jacket up to the throat. "You're warm enough?" she asked. Kate nodded, still too shocked by the thought of her brother being dragged off by the police to function fully. She would wait in the car while Gus and James and the lawyer sorted out this mess. Not the best solution, but the only available one. At 12, Kate was too young to be left alone at night. And who was Gus supposed to call? Her parents lived in Florida. James's would have had heart failure even hearing about this scandal. Melanie, the only close friend Gus would have felt comfortable phoning as a last-minute babysitter, thought that Chris had killed her child. But as much as Gus wished she could have spared her daughter all this, there was a niggling voice in her head that urged her to have Kate as close as possible. "You have one child left," it said. "Keep her in sight." Gus reached across the foot of space between them and smoothed Kate's hair. "We'll be back in a little while," she said. "Lock the doors when I leave." "I know," Kate said, "and be good." Like Chris wasn't. The thought leapt between Gus and Kate, a hideous, traitorous current. And they broke apart before either of them could say it out loud, or admit that they'd even thought it. Next section. Gus and James' heart hovered in the small cone of light produced by the outside lamp at the police station. As if crossing the threshold without a legal knight in tow was unthinkable and surely risky. Jordan raised a hand in greeting as he crossed the street, reminded of that old adage about people who lived together for a long time coming to look like each other. The Harts' features were not so similar, but the singular, burning purpose in their eyes twinned them in an instant. "James," Jordan said, shaking the doctor's hand. "Gus," he glanced toward the door of the station. "Have you been inside?" "No," Gus said. "We were waiting for you." Jordan thought about hustling them into the lobby, but then decided against it. The conversation they were going to have was better done in privacy, and as a former prosecutor, he knew that the walls of cop shops had ears. He pulled his coat a little closer and asked the Harts to tell them what had happened. Gus recounted the arrest during dinner. Through the recitation, James stood off to one side, as if he'd come to admire the architecture rather than protect his son. Jordan listened to Gus, but watched her husband thoughtfully. "So," Gus finished, rubbing her hands together for warmth, "you can talk to someone and get him out, right?" "Actually, I can't. Chris has to be held overnight until his arraignment, which will most likely be in the morning, at the Grafton County Courthouse." "He has to stay in a cell overnight?" "Well, no," Jordan said. "The Bainbridge police aren't equipped to keep him in their holding cell. He'll be moved to the Grafton County Jail." James turned away. "What can we do?" Gus whispered. "Very little," Jordan admitted. "I'm going to go in and speak to Chris now. I'll be there first thing in the morning when he's called in for the arraignment." "And what happens there?" "Basically, the Attorney General will enter the charge against Chris. We will enter a plea of not guilty. I'll try to get him released on bail, but that may be difficult, given the fact that he's up against a very serious charge." "You're saying," Gus replied, her voice shaking with rage, "that my son, who did nothing wrong, has to sit overnight in jail, probably even longer than that, and there's nothing you can do to stop this from happening?" Your son may have done nothing wrong, Jordan said gently, but the police didn't buy his story about the suicide pact. James cleared his throat, breaking his silence. Do you? He asked. Jordan looked at Chris's parents, his mother on the verge of puddling to the sidewalk, his father distinctly embarrassed and uncomfortable, and decided to tell them the truth. It sounds convenient, he said. As Jordan had expected, James looked away and Gus flew off into a rage. Well, she huffed, if your heart's not in it, we'll just find someone else. It's not my job to believe your son, Jordan said. It's my job to get him off. He looked directly into Gus's eyes. I can do that, he said softly. She stared at him for a long moment, long enough for Jordan to feel like she was picking through his mind, sifting the wheat from the chaff. I want to see Chris now, she said. You can't. Only during shift changes. That's several hours away. I'll tell him whatever you want. Jordan held the door of the station open for her. The perfume of her indignation followed in her wake. He was about to move inside himself when James' heart stopped him. Can I ask you something? Jordan nodded in confidence. In confidence? Jordan nodded again, a bit more slowly. The thing is, James said carefully, it was my gun. He took a deep breath. I'm not saying what did or didn't happen. I'm just saying that the police know the Colt came out of my gun cabinet. Jordan's brows drew together. So, James said, does that make me an accessory? To murder? Jordan asked. He shook his head. You didn't deliberately put that gun there with the intention that Chris use it to shoot someone. James exhaled slowly. I'm not saying Chris did use it to shoot someone, he clarified. Yes, Jordan said, I know. And he followed the man into the Bainbridge police station. Okay, next section. When he heard footsteps, Chris came to his feet and pressed his face to the small plastic window of the cell. Lawyers here, the policeman said, and suddenly Jordan McAfee was standing on the other side of the bars. He sat down on a chair the officer brought and took a legal pad out of his briefcase. Have you said anything? Jordan asked abruptly. About what? Chris answered. Anything to the cops, to the desk sergeant, anything at all. Chris shook his head. Just that you were coming, he said. Jordan visibly relaxed. All right, that's good, he said. He followed Chris's glance toward the video camera trained on the cell. They won't tape this, he said. They won't listen to the monitor. That's basically prisoner rights. Prisoner, Chris repeated. He tried to sound like he didn't care, like he wasn't whining, but his voice was trembling. Can I go home yet? No. First off, you don't say anything to anybody. In a little while, the sheriff's going to come take you to the Grafton County Jail. You'll be brought in and booked there. Do what they tell you to do. It's only a few hours. By the time you get up in the morning, I'll be there, and we'll go over to the courthouse for your arraignment. I don't want to go to jail, Chris said, paling. You don't have a choice. You have to be held pending your arraignment, and the prosecutor arranged it so that you'd have to wait overnight, which means Grafton. He looked directly at Chris. She did it this way to scare the shit out of you. She wants you shaking when you see her face tomorrow in the courthouse. Chris nodded and swallowed hard. You've been charged with first-degree murder, Jordan continued. I didn't do it, Chris interrupted. I don't want to know if you did or didn't, Jordan said smoothly. It doesn't matter one way or the other. I'm still going to defend you. I didn't do it, Chris repeated. Fine, Jordan said dispassionately. Tomorrow the prosecutor will move that you be held without bail, which is likely given the severity of the charge. You mean like in jail? Jordan nodded. For how long? Something in Chris's voice struck a chord. Jordan tilted his head, and suddenly the panicked features of his client reconfigured as he was staring at Thomas, much younger, asking when he was going to see his mother again. There was a universal tone of voice for a boy who had just realized he was not invincible, who understood how slowly time could pass. For as long as it takes, he said. Next section. In the middle of the night, James awakened with a start. Disoriented, his mind took him back years, and he sat up abruptly to listen for the thick wail of Kate with an infant's earache, or the sound of Chris's paddling feet as he untangled himself from a nightmare and crept into his parents' bed for comfort. But there was only silence, and his eyes adjusted to the darkness. He realized, as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that Gus's half of the bed was completely empty. He shook off sleep and started down the hall. Kate was snoring peacefully, and Chris's bed was neatly made. The fresh realization hit James just below the breastbone, a physical ache that made him stumble. He wandered downstairs, drawn by a humming sound. A small rosy glow emerged from the mudroom. James walked softly across the kitchen, his back to the wall, stopping a few feet shy from the mudroom. Gus sat on the cold tile floor, her back pressed to the spinning dryer, which she turned on to muffle the sounds of her cries. Her face was red and splotched, her nose running, her shoulders as bent and weary as an old woman's. She had never been a pretty crier. She sobbed the way she did everything else, with passion and excess. That she had managed to keep it inside her this long was astounding to James. He thought of pushing open the half-closed door and kneeling before his wife, wrapping his arms around her shoulders and helping her upstairs. He raised his hand, stroking the wood of the door, planning to say something to calm her. But what wisdom could he offer Gus when he could not even heed himself? James walked upstairs, got into bed, covered his head with a pillow. And hours later, when Gus crept beneath the sheets, he tried to pretend that he did not feel the weight of her grief, lying between them like a fitful child, so solid that he could not reach past it to touch her. Next section. There were high metal fences around the jail, capped off with curls of barbed wire. Chris closed his eyes, wondering with a child's tenacity if maybe he could block the whole ordeal out, so that it wouldn't really be happening. The sheriff helped him out of the car and walked him to the door of the jail. A correctional officer unlocked the heavy steel door to admit them. Chris watched it being secured into place again. "You got another one, Joe?" "Like fleas," the sheriff said. "They just keep on coming." They all seemed to think this was hilarious and laughed for a while. The sheriff handed over a plastic bag, inside which were items Chris recognized: his wallet, his car keys, his loose change. A second officer took it. "You gonna do the paperwork?" "We've got it from here." The sheriff left without even making eye contact with Chris. Alone with two men he knew even less well than he'd known the sheriff, Chris started to shiver again. "Hands out to your sides," one of the officers said. He stood in front of Chris, patting his hands from Chris's neck down to his waist and then up each of his legs. The second officer began to catalog Chris's personal possessions. "Come on." The first guard caught Chris by the elbow and led him toward the booking room. He fussed with a play card, handed it to Chris, then stood him up against a wall. "Smile," he grunted, and there was a flash as a picture was taken. He sat Chris down at the single table, rolled his fingertips in ink again for prints. Then he handed Chris a cloth to wipe his hands off and slid a piece of paper across the table. Chris glanced down at the questionnaire as the officer scrounged for a pencil. "Fill this in," he said. The very first question stumped Chris. "Are you..." I can't say that. "Are you..." I'll just bleep that out. His psychiatrist knew he wasn't. His attorney thought he was. Hesitantly, he checked off yes, then erased it and answered no. "Do you have AIDS? Do you have any ongoing medical problems? Do you wish to see a doctor while here?" Chris chewed at the end of the pencil. "Yes," he checked off, then wrote in the margin, "Dr. Feinstein." He finished the questionnaire and looked over his answers with the same attention to detail he had given the SAT exam. What if someone lied? What if they were really suicidal or dying of AIDS, or said they weren't, and said that they weren't? Who would care enough to check? The officer led him upstairs to a control area filled with a teeny teeny TV monitors. He exchanged some information with the officer on duty, which made no sense to Chris, then guided him toward another small room. As the gate locked behind him, Chris shivered. "You cold?" the officer said dispassionately. "Lucky for you, this room comes with free clothes." He waited until Chris stood up and then handed him a blue jumpsuit. "Go on," he said. "Put that on." "Here?" Chris asked, embarrassed. "Now?" "No," the officer said. "Aruba." He folded his arms. It's no big deal," Chris told himself. He'd stripped naked a million times in the locker room in front of a bunch of guys. One prison guard, and only down to his shorts. That was nothing at all. But by the time he pulled the zipper of the coveralls up to his throat, his hands were trembling so badly he hid them behind his back. "All right," the officer said. "Let's go." He escorted Chris down a hallway into the maximum security division. With every breath, Chris's lungs had to work harder. Was it his imagination, or was the air inside a jail thinner than it was outside? The officer unlocked a heavy door and led Chris onto a narrow, gray catwalk. There were individual cells, two side by side along the catwalk, but the barred doors were open. At the end of the pod, outside the bars, was a TV. The nightly news was on. Suddenly, there was a call through the air, which rippled through the open bars and hollow catwalks. "Lockdown," the voice yelled, and Chris heard the pounding of feet as prisoners slowly returned to their cells. "Here you go," the officer said, leading Chris to an unoccupied cell, bottom bunk. There were 3 other people in the pod. A small man with teeny, deep-set black eyes and a goatee walked into the cell beside Chris's and sat down on the bunk. At the end of the catwalk, the TV blinked back. The officer slid home the door of Chris's cell. The lights dimmed, but did not go out. Gradually, the entire jail hushed, save for the collective breaths of the prisoners. Chris crawled onto the bottom bunk. His eyes adjusted to the dimness he could make out. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, he could make out the form of an officer walking by on the other side of those bars. The flash of a man's smile. Chris rolled over so that all he could see was the cinder block wall that confined him. He pressed a wad of jumpsuit into his mouth to muffle the sound, and he let himself cry. Okay, I just need a break for a second there. Next section. When Michael came down to the kitchen the next morning, he could barely believe his eyes. Melanie stood at the stove, a spatula in one hand and a pot holder gracing the other. He watched her flip a pancake and tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, and he thought, "Ah, yes, this is who I married." He intentionally made a noise so that she would think he was just entering. Turning, Melanie flashed a bright smile. "Oh, good," she said. "I was just going to get you up." "To eat, I hope." Melanie laughed. It was so unfamiliar a sound that both she and Michael stopped for a moment. Then Melanie briskly turned away and picked up a platter of pancakes. She waited until Michael slid into his customary spot at the table, then set them down in front of him while never taking her eyes off his. "Buckwheat," she said softly. "Actually," he said, "the name's Michael." Melanie smiled at him, and without thinking it through, Michael looped an arm around her thighs and drew her closer, pressing his head into her stomach. He felt her hand stroke his hair. "I've missed you," he murmured. "I know," Melanie said. She let her hand linger a moment longer, then pushed back. "You need syrup," she said. She carried a saucepan from the stove, maple syrup bubbling, and drizzled it over Michael's pancakes. "I thought we might take a ride this morning." Michael closed his mouth around a succulent bite of breakfast. He had to worm a litter of puppies next town over, check a colicky horse, and pay a house call on a sick llama. But he hadn't seen Melanie this together in days. "Sure," he said. "I just have to call some people to reschedule." Melanie slid into the chair across from him. When Michael stretched out his hand, she slipped hers into it. "That would be nice," she said. He finished eating and went to his office to make the phone calls. When he returned, Melanie was standing in the front of the mirror in the foyer, running a thin coat of lipstick over her mouth. She smacked her lips together and saw Michael's reflection. "Ready?" she asked. "Sure," he said. "Where are we going?" Melanie linked her arm through his. "If I told you," she said, "it wouldn't be a surprise." Michael silently guessed where she was taking him. Not to Emily's grave. Mel wouldn't be chipper about that. Not out to eat, certainly, although they passed the main strip with all of Bainbridge's restaurants. Not shopping, it was too early. Not to the library, which was in the opposite direction. But then Melanie turned the car out of town. They passed barren fields and dairy farms, long stretches of road with nothing at all. A small green road sign announced that the town of Woodsville was 10 miles away. What the hell was in Woodsville? He'd been there once, to put down a horse that had broken its leg. If he'd driven through the main part of town, he no longer remembered it. Melanie drove past a brick building, from behind which a tuft of barbed wire peeked. And Michael remembered that the county jail was in Woodsville, conveniently down the street from the county courthouse. His wife turned into the parking lot of that courthouse. "There's something here," she said evenly, "that I think you should see." What? What? How far have we made it? We're going to keep going. Next section. Chris was already awake when the door to his cell screeched open at 5:45 a.m. His eyes felt like they had sand under the lids, no matter how much he rubbed them. The zipper of the jumpsuit was cutting into his skin, and he was starving. "Chow," an officer said, slinging a tray into the cell. Chris looked from the unappetizing lumps on the plate to the catwalk. The man with the black eyes was staring at him from the other cell. The man stalked away and disappeared behind a shower curtain. Chris ate, brushed his teeth with the toothbrush he'd gotten in the booking room the night before, and picked up the disposable razor an officer put in his cell. Unsure of himself, he walked out of the cell and down the catwalk to the shower stall and sink. Chris shaved while he waited for the other man to finish showering, squinting into a mirror that offered as clear reflection as tinfoil. When the other man stepped out, Chris nodded and went inside. He drew close the curtain, but just past the edge, he could see the black-eyed man soaping his face in front of the sink, towel slung around his waist while he shaved around his goatee. Chris undressed and hung his clothes over the curtain rod. Then he turned on the water and lathered himself with the soap, closing his eyes and trying to make believe he just swum and trying to make believe he had just swum an in-fucking-credible 400-meter butterfly and was getting ready to go home after the meet. "What are you in for?" Chris blinked water out of his eyes. "Excuse me?" he said. Through the crack between the shower curtain and the wall, Chris saw the man leaning against the sink. "How come you're here?" Wet, his hair reached almost to his shoulders. That was the way Chris could tell the prisoners from the detainees awaiting arraignment. Those serving sentences had their hair cut military short, like his already was. "I shouldn't be here," Chris said. "It's a mistake." The man laughed. "Says you and everyone else. For a prison, there are a heck of a lot of people in here who didn't do jack shit." Chris turned away and soaped up his chest. "Just 'cause you can't see me don't mean I'm gone away," the man said. Shaking water out of his hair, Chris turned off the shower faucet. What did you do? What did you do? "Cut off my old lady's head," the man said dispassionately. Suddenly, Chris felt his knees give out. He did not think he could stay upright, so he leaned against the plastic wall of the shower. He was not standing beside a felon in a county jail. He was not going to be charged with murder. He blindly wrapped his towel around his waist, grabbed his clothes, and stumbled back to his cell, where he sat down on the bunk and tucked his head between his knees so he wouldn't throw up. He wanted to go home. An officer walked to his cell to retrieve the razor he had been given. "Your lawyer's here," he said. "He's brought clothes for you. Get dressed and we'll bring you upstairs to change." Chris nodded, expecting him to stand by and watch him change again. But the officer left. The doors of the cells were open. The man who had decapitated his wife was watching the Today Show at the end of the catwalk. I'm, ready, he said to a different officer who escorted him to the door that led out of the pod. Good luck, the black-eyed man called out, eyes still on the TV show. Chris paused, looked over his shoulder. Thanks, he said softly. The clothes were waiting for him in the booking room. Chris recognized the Brooks Brothers blazer he'd bought with his mother down in Boston. They had gone shopping specifically for an outfit he could wear on college interviews. Instead, he was wearing it to his arraignment. He dressed in the white button-down shirt and gray flannel trousers, the buttery loafers. He slid the tie through the collar of the shirt and tried to knot it, but he couldn't get it right. He was used to watching himself do it in front of a mirror, and there wasn't one in the booking room. He settled for the back tail of the tie hanging a fraction lower than the front. Then he shrugged into his blazer and walked toward the officer who was waiting, doing some paperwork. They walked in silence to a room Chris hadn't seen before, and the officer opened the door. Jordan McAfee was waiting in the interview room. Thanks, he said to the officer, motioning for Chris to sit across from him at the table. He waited until the door closed behind the officer. Morning, he said. How was your night? He knew damn well how it had been. Any idiot could look at the circles beneath Chris's eyes and realize he hadn't slept at all. But Jordan waited to see what his client would say. It would go a long way toward indicating how much fortitude he could expect from Chris for the remainder of the long haul. It was okay, Chris said, unblinking. Jordan stifled a smile. You remember what I told you about today? Chris nodded. Where are my mom and dad? Over at the courthouse, waiting. My mom brought you the clothes? Yes, Jordan said. Nice outfit, very preppy, very classy. It will help set your image for the judge. I have an image? Chris asked. Jordan waved his hand. Yeah, white, upper middle class, student, athlete, rah, good old boy. He locked his gaze on Chris. As opposed to low-life scum murderer. He tapped his pencil on the legal pad in front of him, on which he'd written nonsense. The thing about arrangements was that as a defense attorney, you went in cold, like a cat ready to land on the balls of its feet no matter how it was thrown. You had the charge that had been leveled against a client, but you had no idea what the prosecutor was thinking until you got your hands on the files after the arraignment. Follow my lead today. If I need you to do something, I'll write it on the pad, but this is going to be pretty straightforward. Okay, Chris said. He stood up, shaking his legs as if he were getting ready to step up to the block before a race. So let's go, he said. Jordan glanced up, surprised that he hadn't expected this. You can't walk over to the courthouse with me, he said. The sheriff will bring you over. Oh, Chris said, sinking back into his chair. I'll be there waiting, Jordan hastened to add. So will your parents. Right, Chris said. Jordan slid the legal pad back into his briefcase. He looked at Chris, frowned at his tie. Come here, he said, and when Chris stood, he snugged the tie so that it lay correctly. I couldn't do it right, Chris said. No mirror. Jordan did not say anything. He clapped Chris on the shoulder and nodded at his overall appearance. Then he walked out of the room, leaving Chris to stare at the open door, the hall that led outside the jail.
How y'all feel out there?
I'm light years, call me eons. When the snare kick in, the beat is neon. Lights, yeah, I'm feeling magnificent. Care less what I'm up against.